My name is David Orr, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the first of a series of programs on American democracy, sponsored by the American Renewable Energy Institute. Democracy is under stress here and elsewhere. And the title of our debate tonight, or talk tonight, is on democracy and the future of the vote. It couldn't come at a more timely period in American politics. And just for background, there is no right to vote in the Constitution, nor was there a right to vote given in the Bill of Rights. It's a right that was assumed, and it has been slow to be adapted to American political life over the course of our history. And we find in the election of 2020, the right to vote is still not fully granted. It's under pressure virtually everywhere. So tonight the conversation will be on the right to vote. What do we do to guarantee our rights to vote? That every vote, in fact, will be counted, and in fairly drawn electoral districts. The panel tonight is a distinguished group of Coloradans. Jenna Griswold, the Secretary of State, who is doing fabulous work to preserve the right and extend the right to vote here in Colorado. Governor Bill Ritter, former governor and a leader in progressive politics and causes here in the state, and former Senator Tim Wirth, presently the Chairman Emeritus of the UN Foundation. So with that, let me begin with Jenna.
Well, thank you so much, David, and hello to all the participants at AREDAY. I had such a good time last year, and I just really appreciate, Chip, your leadership and everybody's focus on democracy reform. Because if we do want to see the nation that we can be, we need to start by fighting to make sure that everyday Americans can have their voices heard and elect elected leaders who will listen to them. So thank you for having me again. I will say Colorado is a tremendous leader when it comes to voting. And a lot of that is from the work like people like Governor Ritter, Governor Hickenlooper, our state legislature, who had the foresight to really adopt vote by mail early on. So we became a full vote by mail state. The first election where all ballots were sent to every single voter was in 2014. And that has just led to tremendous results. You know, unlike other places in the nation, we send a mail ballot to every registered voter. We have online voter registration. Believe it or not, in 2020, many states do not have online voter registration. We have a lot of early voting. And of course, we have same-day voter registration. And before the pandemic, we were considered the gold standard of voting. You know, it shouldn't come to a shock to folks that we have the highest percentage of eligible people registered to vote. And we always compete with Minnesota for the top turnout. And I've told Minnesota, by the way, that this year we're going to have the best turnout. So I hope everybody stands with me in my commitment to Minnesota that we're going to beat them. Sorry if there's any listeners from Minnesota. You guys are also pretty good. But I would say, you know, the pandemic really tested our elections nationwide. And in Colorado, we had our presidential primary. By the way, the first presidential primary in 20 years and the first one ever where unaffiliateds participated the week before COVID really started shutting down the nation. And in the months following that, we saw elections that did not work as they should. So the first shock wave for the nation should have been Wisconsin, where in Milwaukee alone, 180 polling centers were reduced to 5. Americans were standing in line 5-6 hours. And unfortunately, over 70 people contracted COVID-19 from being forced into crowded polls. And then we saw Georgia, which was on the heels of the protests against police brutality of Black Americans. And it was just shocking, I hope, to the nation to see predominantly Black Americans standing in line in the rain, in the elements for 5 to 6 hours until 12:35 in the morning. But in the meantime, Colorado's election model is the beacon of hope. And it was tested because the fact of it is that mail ballots allow us to social distance. So in our run up to our statewide primary, we passed various initiatives. We recruited election judges to make sure that we wouldn't have to close polling centers because of a lack of judges. I issued a series of emergency rules to make sure that election judges would wear PPE. We sent PPE to every single county, including hand sanitizer, sanitation of voting equipment. And then we also just pushed Coloradans through a voter engagement to really do their part and help stopping the spread of COVID-19 by using the mail ballot. And it worked. We had a record statewide turnout in the middle of a pandemic, and 99.3% of all ballots were cast using a mail ballot. So Colorado really holds the key to how to vote in any time, but especially during a pandemic. And we've been working across the nation so other states adopt our system. And I will tell you, I know things are very politicized right now, but we have won major battles. In 2016, about a quarter of Americans had access to a mail ballot. The Washington Post is estimating that northwards of 80% of all American voters will have that access, and Colorado is leading the way. So I'm just so honored to be on this panel and honored to serve as Secretary of State, especially during the pandemic and everything else that's going on that I'm sure we'll touch on.
Jenna, thank you so much. Governor Ritter, the transition in Colorado, which resembles Ohio in lots of ways where I live, transition in Colorado from a pretty solid red state to a blue state occurred in large part under your administration. How did you work that, and how does that play into the vote and protecting the right to vote in the state?
I think that there are a lot of forces that caused us to turn from red actually to purple, and then kind of a purplish hue of blue, or a blue hue of purple. I think we still have parts of us that are, pretty different. What's really interesting, David, about this change is actually, if you look at it, when I was elected in 2006, 40% of the electorate was Republican. About 30% was Democratic, 30% was unaffiliated. Now it's about 40% that's unaffiliated, 30% Republican, 30% Democrat. Just about, close, pretty close, right? So it was really conservative Republicans who lost that 10% to unaffiliated. And I don't think unaffiliated became unaffiliated because they wanted to vote on progressive causes. They wanted to vote for whoever they wanted to vote for. They didn't want to be dictated to. And the Republican Party in Colorado was not answering them. Colorado is a very centrist state. If you govern well in Colorado, you're likely governing from somewhere around the center. But the thing that impressed me about what Secretary Griswold just said is that in Colorado, we've taken the tack in the last 14 years of erring on the side of ensuring that people who are legally entitled to vote and are registered to vote get to. And that has meant long lines. I remember the night that I was elected, the polling station that I was voting at, I'd already voted early in the day, but it had to stay open another 2 hours after the polls closed because of the number of people who were there in line trying to vote. I would say around the country, the most important thing is not every state is going to look like its neighboring state or some other state across the country. But the menu of options during the primaries have demonstrated to us how you got to do this during a pandemic. There has to be early voting, and that can be mail ballots. You also can have in-person early voting. There can be absentee voting and absentee ballots in states that don't have kind of all mail in. And then there has to be in-person voting on election day. The other thing about this that I'll say that I've been sort of wondering about, and we get to hear from Senator Wirth, and the work that he's done has just been amazing. But we have a person in the White House who is communicating confusion, communicating what I would call obfuscation, trying to get people to believe that, this system already will not work for them. The media has a responsibility like it's never had in the United States of America to communicate with voters in given states what their rights are, how they're entitled to vote, and the need to be patient about this. This November 3rd is going to look a lot different in many respects than other voting days we've had because of the pandemic in part, but also just because of some of the confusion that's been created by the commander-in-chief. And so for us, we have to ensure, again, that states are communicating with the media about the way it's done in your state, and also that we get states to this place and all the leadership in states of deciding to be like Colorado. That is, to err on the side of ensuring that people who are registered and legally entitled to vote get to. And I'm fairly proud of Colorado for how we've led the way and the kind of example we can show, but we just hope that other states will do the same, because it's a treasured right in the United States, and this year probably should be as treasured as ever.
Governor Ritter and Secretary Griswold, let me ask a question that strays a little bit off the mechanics of voting. Tom Frank, a political writer of some note, wrote a book some years back called "What's the Matter with Kansas?" And his point in the book was that people often vote against their best interest. So politicians come home and they campaign on one issue, they go back to Washington and vote for tax cuts for the wealthy or whatever it might be. And so how do you protect a state like Colorado? How did you guide a state like Colorado so voters go to the polls and vote in an informed way with accurate information about what the issues are? How do they overcome this wave of social media? There's a real question, I think, whether democracy can in fact survive Facebook and social media generally. But how do you counter that? That's a big question. You need to ask it and answer it in great detail. But I'm curious, how do you offset misinformation?
You want to go first, Madam Secretary?
I'm happy to, but also whatever you prefer. Well, first, David, as the youngest Secretary of State in the nation, I fully think that we can survive social media. Social media is not going away. It's just going to increase its use, probably. So I think there are several things that we can do. The number one thing is speaking truth to misinformation. As Secretary of State, I never thought that I would have to inform the President and the U.S. Attorney General that double voting is illegal. But yet, there we are. This is the times we're in. And I do think that elected leaders and just community leaders need to speak truth to lies. But it's more than just independent lies. I think you really are hitting on a really important issue. Social media is used as a tool to suppress voters. We know what Russia did in 2016. They ran campaigns to trick Americans using social media as a tool, trick them out of the votes or tell lies to change votes. And I do think that we need action. Unfortunately, Congress, the administration have not been tough on Russia. You can guess as to why that is. And along those lines, they have not been tough on misinformation. So unfortunately, states really need to lean in. I pulled together, looking at all the federal legislation proposed and all the things that are happening around the states, a package to combat disinformation that we were hoping to get through last legislative session. COVID-19 unfortunately delayed that. But there are things we can do to make sure that we're holding social media accountable and making sure that they are not doing things to jeopardize our democracy. And along those lines, I really do believe, regardless of the election in November, that states really need to think about what it means to run elections. The role of Secretary of State fundamentally shifted in 2016 when our elections were, and our democracy was attacked and attempted to be undermined by foreign countries. So we can lead. So for example, I just launched a new unit. It's called Rescue. It's a rapid response to election threats. Led by a former Assistant Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, who was the person on counterterrorism and elections. And we're thinking about ways to really rise to the challenge that we're in, to counter disinformation, to counter innovative attacks on election structure. So I am confident in our ability as a nation to rise to the challenge. But I do think that elected leaders really need to think about what their roles are and how their roles have changed and how they can best serve their constituents.
Governor Ritter.
Thanks, Jenna. That was really, really good and insightful. And, I go back to your question, David, about the book, What's the Matter with Kansas? And think about that book. I read it and coming from rural Colorado, had some real interest and sympathies for kind of the rural-urban divide. And David, you and I have talked about this. I think, we're not going to heal some of the divides that exist in this country before the election of November 3rd. And that's one of the things that I think has happened, is that people vote in a way that appears to us to sort of be against their interests because they wind up on one side of a chasm or the other. I read a book called The Left Behind by a Princeton professor named Robert Wuffnow, who had spent 10 summers in rural America trying to understand the urban-rural divide. And it's as simple as, in some cases, people just believing that in state capitals and in the nation's capital, the leadership, the political leadership, doesn't really listen and is not in touch with a number of folks in this country. I heard a radio interview this morning of a woman who's a registered Democrat in northern Minnesota, said she's going to vote for Trump. She'd like to vote for Trump, and that's because she feels like her party has left her behind. And so for my purposes, whatever happens on November 3rd, it's so important that the political leadership in this country begin to understand that we're all one country and not divided, and try and find ways to communicate in a really open and honest and even humble way with the people who are their constituents across the board, not just the people who voted for them, not just the people in their political party, not just the people in their urban or, one or two suburban rings out, but with the entire constituency that they serve, or even that somebody else may serve, and understand we're all Americans. And I think healing has to be such a part of answering this question about why people may be voting for things that appear to be against their self-interest.
Well, two great answers. Senator Worth, you've written a couple of very powerful op-eds, and the point of which is that what happens if we come to a situation where our votes don't matter, a takeover. And Sinclair Lewis years ago wrote a book called It Can't Happen Here. And now for the first time, at least in my lifetime, I think there are questions that it can happen here. So I guess the question I have is, what do we do to guarantee that the succession of power does occur as it's always occurred, peacefully? And what do we do if we fail at that? What's the plan forward?
Well, David, thank you very much. And to all of you, it's great to be with you. David's work on democracy has been legendary for so many people across the country, and we appreciate it, David. And Jenna, you are a voice of energy and youth and incredible precision. Jenna and I were on a panel together in Philadelphia last week on all of the complexities that are going to infect the Pennsylvania election, and you were then a star, and they let you out of Pennsylvania Law School to come back to Colorado. That's a good thing. Bill Ritter, thank you. You've been a hero of mine on issues related to climate and the environment for a long time, and the way you have handled that in a very constructive fashion. So it's good to be with you all. You talk about the change of Colorado from generally a redder state to a bluer state. You believe it or not, when I first ran for Congress, Boulder was Republican. Boulder County was Republican. And it was a big upset when the Boulder Camera endorsed me. That in 1974 caused the camera editor to have to leave town. He said that the outrage was so great. Anyway, we've come a long way, and Colorado's come a long way, and it's been a great trip. Talking about the platforms, let me just comment on that briefly. I think that we really have to think a lot more seriously about the internet platforms and what they are doing in our country. One of the things that's impressed me about this Congress, and there aren't very many, but one of the things that have impressed me is how bipartisan the concern is about the power of a few platforms, and how unresponsive they are to a general sense of public policy in the public realm, and that there are really changes and times are coming. And I think that that's extremely important. We have to make these very, very large platforms much more accountable to what goes on in America, and much less accountable to the whims of the people who run the platforms. And that has to be coupled, Jenna, which I know you know a lot about this, with the building the internet out so that everybody has access. It is absolutely criminal. You watch kids now across the country going back to school, and some can't get on the internet. They say, oh, we'll have online classes. Well, they can't have online classes because they can't get on. And even if there is some kind of low power internet available, it's so overwhelmed by the numbers. And it's just terrible. We had at one point a commitment in the country to universal telephone service, universal electrical service, and we ought to have the same thing for the internet, and yet it's controlled, again, by a few very large corporations who are not exercising their responsibilities as Americans. So this all goes back to the broader mission, which we're all thinking and working on, which is what are citizens expected to do, and what kind of support can be given to citizens so they can exercise their responsibilities. We're facing an election unlike, as everybody has said, anything that we've ever had. It's going to be one extraordinarily difficult rodeo between now and the 20th of January when a new president is sworn in. And we've been extremely worried. The group that I'm involved with we started being very worried about the election and the fact that we didn't think that the president would leave. He has made it very clear that he is not sure that he's going to would not comport with the results of an election. I think he will do absolutely anything in his power to stay in office. And the worst word in his vocabulary is loser. And he does not want to be the most significant loser in American political history. So every tool is being engaged by him to dissuade people from voting, to keep people concerned about violence at voting places. And when we get after the 3rd of November, when we get into the counting process, we can talk about this a little bit later. You know, what happens when there are competing states of electors? How do we resolve those differences? We're going to be into an area of law and parliamentary maneuver, the likes of which we've not seen before. We can come back and talk about that. I'll drop off at this point and open it to a broader discussion. We're very concerned about what's going to happen with the Electoral College and the debates around that. And we're very concerned about the president's exercise of his vast emergency powers. He's got powers that nobody really knows very much about. The Congress has never discussed them. They've not been illuminated to the public, and he can do just about anything he wants. And the greatest defense against that is going to be what we call a citizens firewall. You know, citizens getting together in every possible way, businesses and students and the press and state and local governments, to banding together to say, we have got to make this system work. It's our legacy, it's our future. If we can't make this election work, we're going to lose our democracy. We can make it work, and we can make the vote, fair, and we can make it safe, and we can make it fully counted. But it's going to take a lot of work over the next 90 days to make sure that happens. Anyway, David, thank you very much. You're just a great guy and a great model for us to think about, how we ourselves are citizens.
Well, Tim, thank you for that. Let me press you a little bit further on this. The shutting down of polling places, the attack on, which I think it is an attack on post offices, the suppression of the vote that we saw in Georgia in the last gubernatorial election. Speak a little bit about, if you would, the reforms that have to be made to protect the apparatus of voting, including post offices.
Well, there's so many, as Jenna knows, there's so many changes that have to be made. She's been one of the people talking about and working on that. So many changes that have to be made. One positive note is when the administration tried to shut down a lot of the Postal Service, there was a tremendous outrage in the country, and it stopped them. That was citizen action, stopping them from taking those steps. Now, what did that tell us? Well, it tells us that we've got to somehow figure out, and Jenna, you know more about this than I do, some kind of uniformity in the way in which absentee ballots are done, the way in which they are sent out to people, the form that they take, how they're counted, when they get sent out. There are a whole series of very important, highly technical issues related to absentee ballots. That's just one of the areas that is extremely important, because we're going to have more and more absentee ballots in the future. People like it. They're going to, as you know, they're going to become accustomed to it. And, you know, we can't let there be this strong bipartisan split on absentee ballots. You know, apparently the data is such that about 25% of Republicans are going to vote in person, and about 75% of Democrats are going to vote by mail. So we have this tremendous split between the two, and a culture that gets a gap in the culture of voting, which is very dangerous, and we have to heal that. It will never get healed as long as we have a president who's railing against voting by mail at the same time that he, of course, is voting by mail himself. Don't watch what I say. Don't watch what I do. Watch what I say. Whatever it is, you know, he's that malignant figure at the other end of the discussion. But that's one of the pieces, David. There are many, many more of them that have to be addressed. But this is a critical one, and I know Jenna might want to comment on what she thinks can be done. Nothing can be done now. You know, we're way behind now. But for the future, let's hope that this issue of voting and fair voting and timely voting and counting the votes gets high enough on the agenda at a time when the Congress is going to be totally overwhelmed by a whole variety of other things, that it's these kind of good government measures that all too often end up in last place in terms of the time and attention of the Congress. And, you know, we've got to really work on this in 2021 to get it toward the top of the agenda.
Governor Ritter, is this: you've worked very eloquently on democracy and good governance and so forth, and also renewable energy. And I wonder if a brighter future isn't in some way contingent on or dependent on our putting people to work to develop renewable energy technologies, to solarize the country, improve efficiency, and so forth. You've done so much in Colorado. We haven't done that in Ohio, but would you comment on the connection of democracy and how we power this country?
Yeah, thank you, David. And I'd like to talk as well, if I can, bring in a thread of racial justice, because I think there's a way to braid this. And partly it's that, you know, we know that there are major utilities across the country that now recognize they have to change their emissions portfolio. They're going to reduce their emissions. We have XL Energy in Colorado that said 80% by 2030. There are others that have, you know, and XL has a 100% goal as well, but there are all sorts of these big utilities, and that's just the utility part of it, not the cooperative, which is also moving the same direction. So what there's going to be here, David, is a massive infusion of capital that will come into the energy transition that is a clean energy transition. And there's, you know, a lot of places where we have to change this: the transportation sector, the industrial sector, the ag sector. Those sectors have to come along on the emissions part of it. But in the near term, the electricity sector is going to change in this very serious way. Secondly, I believe there's going to be another stimulus bill. And if, you know, Joe Biden's elected and Democrats hold the Congress and have the Senate, there could be a massive infusion in a stimulus that's also about clean energy. But we can not only see that happen and have like a rebuilding of the American energy economy, we can do it in a just way. We can do it with an eye toward changing the workforce. We can do it with an eye toward that capital infusion going into communities of color. And we can even ensure that there's some ownership built into that for communities of color, for people of color who felt very much also left behind in this discussion. So it's this idea about rebuilding an energy economy in America where there's economic justice, there's environmental justice, and there's racial justice. And imagine what a different kind of world it would be if we said that's going to be the braid, those are going to be the strands. It doesn't probably happen unless this election comes out a certain way. The Trump administration has been as hostile toward progress on environmental issues, on climate issues. And if they stymie that, then this sort of grand vision about rebuilding an economy in America that's a just economy and that is sensitive to the environment, to businesses, and to people of color, that probably doesn't happen the same way. So you can tell where I'm going on election day in terms of how I'm going to vote. But I think there's this grand vision that we could have that takes all the lessons we've learned both from the pandemic and from Black Lives Matter and use it as a Franklin Delano Roosevelt America moment where we rebuild this country in a more just way.
That's a great answer, and it fits the state of Ohio, where deaths of despair are from drug overdose and so forth are plaguing the state. We're going to have to take a break. Jenna Griswold has got to go back to defend democracy and work. Jenna, it's been great having you on the program, and your work is absolutely incredible and so important. And we want you to come to Ohio to be Secretary of State here when you get done with Colorado. But would you make some final summary remarks?
Well, I'll actually respond to some of what the senator and the governor said, because I think it's right on. And I also think there's nuances state to state. Following on what Governor Ritter said, I do think that the Trump administration has also been incredibly hostile to people of color. And it's no mistake that the attacks on our elections and this voter suppression is happening right now, because he knows that voter suppression tends to suppress the vote of people of color. And I would say, as a Secretary of State responsible for having access for all communities, that we need to recognize that voter suppression is often, if not always, systemic racism. And one of the tools that we have as a nation, and one of the reasons that we should all be very hopeful, is that vote by mail is one of the ways that we increase access to all communities. When Colorado adopted vote by mail for all, we increased participation rates by 9%. And that includes, by the way, equally among Republicans and Democrats. It was an 8% increase among affiliateds. But we did see a 13% increase among Black voters, a 10% increase among Latino voters, double digits among younger people, 16% increase among younger people. And it's one of the ways that we can try to make sure that all communities have access to the polls. And commenting a little bit on what the wonderful senator said, Colorado sure has come a long way and has changed in many ways since when he ran. But I do think I agree with a lot of what he's saying. I was very fortunate yesterday to be in Southwest Colorado. I went to meet with the Ute Mountain Ute, and then local elected officials in Cortez and in Durango. And it's true. And when we're talking about broadband, there is not, we can tell folks, okay, all students go remote, everybody go work remote. But if you don't have the ability to do that, we're talking about major disparities in both access to education and the workforce. And that's something we really need to talk about. I think in Colorado, we have the most accessible elections in the nation. But there's still more work to do. Native Americans living on tribal lands did not have a guaranteed right to vote until the 70s in Colorado. There's a lot of work to do. But I will say the Colorado election model is, I really believe, a beacon of hope, because we're dedicated to innovation, but we also see results. And vote by mail in Colorado has been used by Republicans in a really big way, by Democrats in a really big way. In the last 2 out of 3 general elections, more Republicans used a mail ballot, even with in-person early voting and same-day election day in-person voting, than Democrats. And one of the things that gives me hope, Senator, is that on June 30th for our statewide primary, a higher percentage of Republican voters used a mail ballot than Democrats.
Oh, really?
So at the very least, yeah. So that's meaningful to see Secretary of State Wayne Williams, who opposed vote by mail but now defends it, to see people like Cole and other elected Republicans defend our voting model, but then see also voters who are Republican continue to use vote by mail, I think is really meaningful. And lastly, I will just say that we're talking about, the post office, vote by mail, all these different things happening as an effect of the voter suppression tactics. But I think it's worth saying that this president is openly saying he does not want Americans to vote to take political power. He has told us that he doesn't want vote by mail because Democrats will use it, when we know historically, before he started shifting the politics, that's just not true. He's willing to make all of us risk our lives, possibly lose our lives during a pandemic, so he can keep political power. A lot of Americans are dead because of the coronavirus, and the president is so focused on suppressing the vote instead of suppressing the virus. And I think it's just shameful, it's un-American, it's undemocratic. And what we are seeing is a pattern of voter suppression. He doesn't want people to use mail ballots. He attacks the post office to try to stop mail ballots. He's threatened to send police officers, armed forces, to polling centers, which is a tactic straight out of the Jim Crow South. and the attacks go on and on. So I do think that we are at a point in our democracy where we do have to stand up. And Senator Worth, I do think that you do see folks, everyday people, standing up. That's why I ran for office, right? That's why we had in a Secretary of State's race over 650 volunteers, because everyday people realize that there's so much at stake. Folks from all across the country realize there's so much at stake. Republicans, independents, and Democrats are among all the people that care so much about this country and want it to go in the right direction. So overall, I know we have a couple of tough months and a tough road ahead of us, but I am overall very optimistic about where this country can go, and just the advances in access to the polls that we will likely see in November. It's not going to be without shaky steps, but I do think that this country is can go in the right direction. And just so thankful for people like Governor Ritter, for you, David, for Senator Worth, for Chip, and this whole community that are so focused on making sure that, just not all of our personal bottom lines are in order, but that our nation and our communities are going in the right direction. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for everything you do every day.
Well, Janet, thank you so much. We appreciate your work, and it is incredibly valuable. Your light shines here in Ohio and all over the country, so thank you for that.
You. Okay, thank you so much, David. You all stay safe, and I look forward, hopefully, to our day in person sometime soon.
Thanks.
See y'all later.
Senator Worth, question for you. Going to 35,000 feet, support for democracy has been declining for some years worldwide. So poll data shows that support across most age groups shows a precipitous decline in the faith in democracy and also the faith in governments. And these are obviously related. And I wonder if you could put this in your perspective as an international person with lots of experience at that level through the UN Foundation, your role as a senator and traveling the world. What do we do about that? How do we restore the faith in democracy? How do we make it work for people around the world and also back here at home where the same trends are showing up?
Well, it's the $64,000 question for all of us and for the future of, say, Western liberal democracy, if in fact we want to, make sure that we can reinforce that and try to strengthen it. I've been interested on a positive side, watching what's happening in Europe right now, that, the European Union and the European community was really in a decline, and they'd lost confidence in themselves, and Brexit was there. And suddenly in the last year and a half, they've caught fire again, and they've come back together again, and they've figured out the economics of how to manage many of the problems inside the union. And it's been a very positive step. I mean, they are the other major force for in Western industrial democracies, liberal democracies, in addition to Japan, of course. But the European bloc and the US together were very important. So watching that happen has been great. Obviously, the demise of leadership from the United States has had a huge impact. And people watch us very closely, always have. We've said to people, watch us. We're the beacons of democracy, and we've made something of a joke of that in the last 3 years. And we've really challenged and not supported our alliances and the people that we have historically worked with, and that's got to be rehabilitated. I can't tell you, I've been in dozens and dozens of sessions around the world, and when I was first doing this for the State Department in the late 80s, early 90s, I was always so thrilled by the fact that people waited. What does the United States think? How would you handle this question? What are you all going to do about it? And we were almost inevitably well-staffed, had done our homework and had thought it through. We're cautious. It wasn't crazy. And we were supportive of the best instincts around the world. So the role of these two great blocs is terribly important, Europe and the United States. And the third element that I would point to is, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, the internet. And the internet, we have not figured out, how it can be as positive a force as it could be. Rather, it has eroded so many different institutions and and that has been a real problem. We have to figure out how we're going to deal with shared information and the press. You can't have a democracy without shared information. It's just not possible. And you can't strengthen your institutions unless you have a shared base of information. So how we do that with the demise of the printed press? Are we going to? Maybe we're going to discover some other kind of an economic model for the printed press, but we certainly can have a much more accountable model among all of the big internet platforms. And again, I would go back to, I think it's very interesting to listen to what goes on Capitol Hill at a time when nobody can get along with anybody. One of the few things that people have talked about together is the need to make these very, very large institutions more accountable. There's a lot of discussion of antitrust, real discussion of regulatory activities for the internet, of course, resisted very aggressively by the big platforms. But I think there's a power to political change that can be properly managed, can be a very good force. What a new administration does with that, what a new FCC does with that is very important. So I'd speak to Europe, American leadership, and the internet as three items that I can think of right away in answer to your question.
Governor Ritter, short question for you. COVID has put American institutions under incredible stress. And in some way, it's a preview of what I think climate change, as it unfolds in this country, may be like. Institutional failures, supply chain disruptions, health issues, and so forth. Question for you is, as large, can democracy survive rapid climate change?
You know, I have a pretty good friend. I don't want to pretend this is my own thinking, but he said, neither climate change nor even a pandemic are black swan events. They're not something that we should not have been able to foresee, at least as a possibility, and then act in a behavior that took into account the level of the risk and the need for action. And so we've seen the pandemic take us by surprise. We've seen denial, the president denying it and even, saying that it was under control or going to come under control, those kinds of things. So we actually have presaged what it will be like if we don't take action on climate change. And I think we're experiencing impacts of climate change that scientists have thought were 10 or 15 or 20 years off, and it's not waiting for that. So we need to act, and we need to act now. The question you asked is, can democracy sort of get a handle on this? And I just want to add something to Senator Worth's comments about democracy. And I thought that was a great discussion globally. I think here in the United States, and I've had a few different people say this to me, Senator, that the problem in Congress is they exalt being in a majority over constitutional principles. And it's not the province of one or another political party. It's actually, I think, what's happened in Colorado when you see this growth in political unaffiliated voters registering as unaffiliated because the two-party system, they don't like it a lot. And part of the problem, there are many fall guys for this probably, but I'd have to say special interest politics fueled by excessive amounts of money, even obscene amounts of money, has really had a role to play in the politicization of a lot of issues in this country, including climate change. Climate change there was far more sort of bipartisan support for acting on this in the late 90s, the early 2000s. And then I think it'd be fair to say we saw a lot of money dumped into this by different kind of interest groups, the Koch brothers and Americans for Prosperity, also the coal industry, which has a real grip on the Trump administration. And that kind of special interest politics caused people who were pretty reasonable on the conservative side and looking at climate change to back off. And again, I don't want to pretend this is just the province of the Republicans. I think that there are issues that we in the Democratic Party and people who are concerned about progressive politics allow special interests to have an outside influence. And what happens in a democracy, even in a representative democracy like the United States and different States in a federal system is when interest groups' influence grow, people feel less empowered. And I think that book I referenced before, the book called The Left Behind, people have felt like, okay, special interest politics matters more to folks in my state capital or in Washington, D.C. And so I, out here in this little rural community of Hugo, Colorado, don't feel like anybody's listening to my voice. And I don't think it's just Hugo, Colorado. I think it's all over the United States, and even in some places where suburban and urban voters feel that special interests trump the day, pardon the pun, but they have a greater and outsized influence on our democracy. And so we have to figure out what we do as a nation about the outsized influence of special interest. And that at the core means we have to figure out what we do about the kind of money that is spent in elections in America to really decide elections in many places.
And you know, the people in Hugo are absolutely correct about this. David, you've done a lot of thought. Let Bill and me ask you. You've done a lot of work on this and all of your work on democracy. How do you answer your own question?
I'm supposed to be the moderator here.
Well, that's all right. We're not going to let you get away with that. Yes, that's the easy way out, David, or we're not going to let you get away with that.
Well, Senator, I think that's a good question. I think we have to go back and understand why we, the people, are important and how we, the people, can be made or can help make a government that actually works. Our democracy is appended to a constitutional structure that was created in an agrarian age. It hasn't really been modernized. If I was to put the question back to you, what problem has our national problem, has our democracy solved in the past 50 years? Hard pressed to come up with a good answer at a scale that really matters. When we had to cobble together a climate bill a decade or so back, that was a 1,300-page monstrosity with all kind of loopholes and exceptions and so forth. It should have been a 13 or 15-page bill. And now we face the issue of how do we sequester carbon? When the British Empire decided to do away with slavery, they had two choices. They can confiscate the slaves or they could compensate the owners of the slaves. But they didn't fight a civil war like we did to end slavery. And the way that has been our curse, and the Civil War in lots of ways has never ended, as we've seen. So I think the question is an open question. It's up to our generation to build a new answer to that, why we, the people, are important. And the we, I think, has got to be, I don't mean to talk too long here, but the we has got to be highly educated, accurately informed, have access to information. The voting has to be done in a way that we celebrate voting. We make voting perhaps a holiday. We have fair electoral districts, but we have to create, I think, a federal right to vote and then enforce that and mandate the fairness of it. If I was to, one other thing, Governor Ritter, you mentioned black swan events, which leads to the work of Nicholas Taleb. I think we, the people, and much of your work on energy, and Senator, your work as well, has been about building resilience from the bottom up. Communities that can thrive because they're designed to be resilient. Here's where this whole field of ecological design and energy systems, I think, could help support democracy. Locally owned utilities, distributed energy, as our mutual friend Amory Lovins has been saying for years. But I think that's the heart of the answer. Senator, I think that this is the question in this election. Why is democracy important? And it's an open question until we, the people, answer it with the affirmative that democracy is important. The last thing I think is that for all its imperfections, it's the only system of government that has ever tried to protect human rights and human liberty. Imperfectly, yes, but that is baked into the proposition of democracy. I'll rest my case.
That was fantastic.
Well, the first big test of all of this is obviously this election. And that, we have to make this election work. We cannot let it get corroded away and stolen away. And this is the big test. And I again, go back to what I said earlier about creating a citizens firewall. We all have to be part of that citizen commitment, patriots, to make it work. and to say to people, yes, we can do this. We've met the challenge many times in our history, and we're going to meet the challenge again now. And that will give us a boost of confidence when we do that, which I think we will. It's going to be difficult, but I think we will. One final, I would make another positive point on this, and that is if I look at the great work that Bill Ritter has done related to, really moving the energy world in a constructive way so that people don't feel threatened and they can see this as an opportunity. I watched that young group. I was there the first day and testified before AOC, the first day that she was sworn in and the first day of that Congress. And I'll tell you, the excitement in that room at all levels, the more senior people, more senior members and so on, two other people and I were the two witnesses, and it was really electric. And you could feel the energy and you could feel it, just the sense of possibility and change. Now that's going to be in a lot of places. I think we're seeing that in many, many places. And there's a generational shift. Jenna, in many ways, is part of that. You can imagine Jenna Griswold as this terrific young Secretary of State from a Western state. Whoever would have dreamt that, Ritter, when you and I were beginning in the political world, it wouldn't have happened. And this energy and idealism, there's a lot of it pumping out there, and we have to let that get voice too. And the first place is going to be the election this November.
Yeah.
Well said.
Governor Ritter, you cited a book by Robert Westnow on rural America. Expand a little bit on that, because I think the battles, if I go south of our little town of Oberlin here, northern Ohio, I get down in the middle part of the state. It's Republican state. Trump signs are all over. And he is leading. The last poll showed that he's leading about by 5%.
In Ohio?
And most of those voters don't think that the Democratic Party has done anything for them. That book, Deaths of Despair, is largely about opioid addiction and deaths of middle-aged to elderly white men who feel there's no hope, that they didn't stand for them. But they'll vote for Trump because he was a disruptor. Talk a little bit about, if you would, a campaign that works in states like that. How do we rejoin rural America with the American dream?
Yeah, that's, I think, another $64,000 question. If you are in a state that experiences that kind of a divide, I do think it's a fair criticism that the Democratic Party probably quit paying attention to issues that had to do, or that impacted rural America. And it's not, I mean, there are people who are absolutely Democrats in rural America, but I think what Trump did was tap into their frustration and their anger and their loneliness. They're feeling like they were isolated because people weren't coming there and people weren't responding. And people, when they came, they didn't listen and listen well. And we've got a senator in Colorado who was educated at Yale, raised in Washington, D.C. I appointed him to be a United States senator when there was an open seat, and he went first to rural Colorado and began just a series of listening sessions that truly were listening sessions, because he didn't know a lot about it. Then he got on the Ag Committee, and as you said, nothing's perfect about the situation, but I think he's done a fairly good job of trying to ensure that he's connected with those issues. And that's a time that takes a lot of time to do, and it takes a lot of energy and a lot of effort. But I think there's a lot of people in political life who have stopped doing that. And so I feel like there's a real way to restore this. The other really unfortunate thing that's happened is that we've also politicized this issue around clean energy and the transition on clean energy. And so again, there are rural communities that are coal-dependent communities that are experiencing this awful transition where their economic vitality is going away altogether because they had leadership telling them that they were going to resuscitate the economy if only they could get into power. And it's not happening. It didn't happen. And now we have, Gillette, Wyoming, and Craig, Colorado, and the Navajo tribal station, the Navajo generating station on Navajo lands, in Arizona, those are all going to be devastated by this. And we need people in there who are not from there, but are political leadership listening to how people are thinking about their economic future. And we call it the just transition is one of the sort of tags that it has right now. And that should be a bipartisan thing. There should be people from both sides of the aisle, people from urban and rural areas who are in those communities saying, how do we restore the vitality of it? And I think that's part of it. It's not all of it. And, you know, like Senator Wirth said, we're not going to get this done before November 3rd. So that's why I think of the need to really focus on healing some of the divides, healing some of the chasms after this election as part of the mandate to lead.
Let me ask the two of you, how important is your experience, Bill, or how important in Ohio is universal access to the internet, quality, affordable access to the internet? How important is that in these parts of Ohio? How important is that in the rural areas in your experience, Bill?
Can I go first, David? Because when you said that first, especially with online learning during a pandemic, but even, you know, just access to information beyond that, I campaign on bringing ubiquitous broadband to Colorado. And, you know, and I had companies, private sector companies telling me they wanted to be a part of that. We talked a lot about it during the funding for AREI, but that last mile is pretty expensive. And I'm now at a place, Senator, where I don't think it gets built without government support.
Exactly.
But
I mean, we had government support for universal access for electricity. We brought it the last mile.
Yes.
You know, we had universal access for a telephone service. We brought it the last mile, and it was done with government subsidy. And I don't see why. It seems to me it's just so obvious that this is a lifeline for America, and is a place for really helping to retie the country. You get it again, and having people feel that they're being treated equally. If you can't get on, and your kid has to go online, and he has to go down to the local 7-Eleven and sit in the parking lot so maybe he can get enough of a signal to do his homework, you know, that's a terrible situation.
Here's another statistic to add to that. The University of Colorado chancellor at the Anschutz campus was the COO for me when I was governor, Don Elliman. And during the pandemic, they went to, I think the number was something like 100 telehealth calls to, you know, an order of magnitude 5 or 6 times that on a daily basis. So telehealth is this other way that people in rural America are reached with healthcare, with a modern healthcare system, and it cannot happen without broadband. And so it is education, healthcare. I mean, you just kind of go down the list. We should have done that long ago. We had the capability of doing it at various times, but this is the time to do it now because of what's been demonstrated.
We've got these large companies that are doing very well, are enormous concentrations of wealth. And this can only be done if the government tells them that they have to do it and makes it possible, I think. David, I didn't, how would this play? How important would this be in you know, south of Oberlin?
Senator, if you had asked the question 2 years ago, I would have said not very important. If you ask it today, I think it is very important in rural places like Ohio. And the whole infrastructure, starting with broadband, but also roads and high-speed rail and so forth. It's time to rebuild the country, and we're lacking that kind of vision right now. It's not that we can't do it, it's that we don't have the leadership to help us do it. So I think that's a great question. We need to
that rebuilding is jobs, jobs, jobs. I mean, that is absolutely.
Right. And Governor Ritter, your work on renewable energy is, I think, one of the keys of this, to power America with efficiency and sunshine. So let me ask one last question. If you have anything more to say, any final statements, if there was one change you could make, what would it be? And I'll make a short closing remarks, but Governor Ritter, let's start with you. If you could make one change right now, what would it be?
I would overturn Citizens United.
Amen. Senator?
Yeah, I guess if I've made it clear, if I were in the Congress now, I would have, you know, universal access to broadband be the number one important thing. You're absolutely right on all these reform issues and voting and Citizens United and so on. But in terms of a program where you actually people are doing X, Y, and Z and could see the results, That's what I'd drive that if I were a member of the United States Senate today.
Two good answers. I want to thank Chip Cummins for organizing this and for his work on keeping these conversations going through AREDAY and AREI. Governor Ritter, thank you for being the public citizen that you are and for leading on so many important issues. And Senator Worth, longtime friend, thank you for a life of service to this country, and your wisdom and leadership is now more important than ever. So with that, we'll sign off. Thanks to all of you.
Thanks, David. You've done a great job. Thanks ever so
David,
much.
I appreciate it.
Bill, great to be with you, Bill. I mean, it's always a
Likewise.
treat.
Always good to be with all of you. And it's people like you and Jenna Griswold to give me hope. We're going to win this. We're going to come out the other side, I think.
We're going to win this.